All right. Hello, everyone. It's August 13th, 2019, here on the Georgetown Podcast Club, Season 1, Episode 6. I'm Dan, and today we would like to welcome philosopher and political scientist Jason Brennan. Jason is most known for his theories on democracy, libertarianism, and ethics. He's best known for his work against democracy, in which he argues for a form of epistocracy, which we will get into later. He's currently a professor at Georgetown University and a pretty well-known libertarian. Thank you, Jason, for being here. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yep, and Brett will not be joining us. He has to attend to his day job, which has taken up a lot more of his time. So I just wanted to kind of open it up with a quote from Against Democracy. Democracy does not empower individuals. It disempowers individuals and instead empowers the majority of the moment. And I just kind of wanted to start out with that because I think your critique of democracy has at the same time ruffled a lot of feathers, but also opened a lot of minds. So if you could kind of go into that dynamic that you said there, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So that quote that democracy does not empower individuals, it's not even necessarily a critique of democracy. It's actually what democracy is supposed to do. If in a democratic system, your opinion and your acting and your voting really made a difference, there would be something wrong with that system, because the whole point is that it's supposed to be wresting power away from individuals, making it so individuals don't make much of a difference, and instead making it so that a collective makes a difference. It's supposed to be about like whatever the most people want, or depending on the voting system, the plurality of people or what have you. So, in different voting systems, different individuals have different amounts of power, but in no system do you have much influence as a voter. And so the reason that quote is in the book, the point of it is to say, when people talk about what justifies democracy, one of the arguments they like to make is that democracy is justified to you because you have a say in what government does, because it empowers you, because it liberates you in virtue simply of giving you a right to vote. And I'm very skeptical of that claim. It doesn't give you much power. It also means that if we're talking about political equality, we have to recognize that when we're talking about equal voting rights, it's not like we're talking about equal slices of the cake. It's more like we're talking about equal crumbs. Like you just don't have much influence. So to put it into like some numbers, there's some debate in political science about how much your vote makes a difference, and it also depends on which country you live in and what thing you're voting on and so on. But a good way of thinking about it is that on the most optimistic model in the literature, you have as high as about a 1 in 20 million chance of being decisive in a presidential election, but only if you vote in one of like 3 or 4 swing states. If you're living in California or Texas or most other states, you basically have no chance of making a difference. And that's on the optimistic model. On a more common but less optimistic model, your chances of making a difference in the U.S. presidential election are roughly on par with the chance that as you sit in your chair, you'll spontaneously quantum tunnel through it and appear on the other side. So, so whatever democracy is good or bad for, we shouldn't treat it as though what makes democracy good for us is that you make any kind of real difference. You don't, and you're not supposed to.
I think, wouldn't a better definition of democracy be a series of groups competing against each other for control of something?
Yeah, I mean, even how to define it is one of those things that people fight over in theory, but I use a pretty minimal definition where I say a system is politically democratic to the extent that fundamental political power is shared equally among all members of that society. So even on that definition, no real country is democratic because almost all of them exclude children and exclude certain other people that are arguably members of the society. But that's the idea, shared equal political power. But when you have a lot of people, that doesn't amount to very much. There's 210 million eligible voters in the United States. I'm one of 210 million. So the way that I vote, the way that I exercise my political power has no real influence. What matters is if a group does something, not whether you do something. How we vote matters, how you vote does not.
And I remember a while back, you had posted on Facebook about the voting age, and you kind of remarked on how arbitrary it is. And, I mean, do you think that voting qualifications are just simply arbitrary and they're kind of counter to the idea of democracy?
Yeah, well, it's in a sense not arbitrary for the following reasons. What most people actually use the right to vote to signal is something like that you're a full member of our society. It has this kind of symbolic element built into it. So sort of imagine, for the sake of argument, a society kind of like ours, but imagine they don't really have democracy or anything else. Forget, it doesn't matter what kind of political system they have, but upon age 18, what happens is the government gives you a red scarf, and you put this red scarf on, you wear it outside, and that's the way that they demarcate that you're considered a full and equal member of that society, that they respect you and think you're one of them. And you can imagine in the history of that society that for the first 100 years they didn't give women the red scarf, but then after a bunch of activism they finally started giving red scarves to women. And for the first 150 years they didn't give black people the red scarf, but then after activism they started giving it to blacks. And then it used to be that you didn't get a red scarf until age 21, but finally got lowered to age 18 because they said that's when you're considered an adult, and so we're going to give you the red scarf then. You can understand how this red scarf story might work. Effectively, what we do in the United States and what people do in most modern democracies is use a voting right to indicate this kind of, like to do what the red scarf does, to indicate that you're a full member of society. And that's why in many countries, if you commit a crime, if you commit a felony or something like the equivalent of that, they might strip your right to vote. If they in other way deem you to be like inferior or not a full member, they take your right to vote away. And we don't give it to children, in part because we think they're not like full members of society yet. I mean, I'm not saying I endorse that. I'm saying that's how average people think. But otherwise, if it weren't for that kind of symbolic story, it would be kind of arbitrary. Because if you ask typical people, well, why don't we let a 5-year-old vote? Why don't we let a 12-year-old vote? They'll say, oh, simple. Well, most of these children aren't actually competent to vote. They have very little information. They don't know how to process that information. They're kind of irrational. They're ignorant. So we shouldn't let them vote. The problem, though, is it's true. Those complaints are correct. Most 12-year-olds know nothing about politics, and if they voted, they'd vote idiotically. Most 5-year-olds, the same thing. But it's also true of most adults. In fact, there's not some sharp point at age 18 where people become better informed. Instead, what you find is that between the ages of 5 to about 40, people start to become slightly more informed. Between the ages of about 40 to 55, they kind of max out in the total amount of information they're going to have. And then after age 55, they start becoming less informed on average. But even then, the effects are not super dramatic. It's not that the average 55-year-old is very well informed and the average 18-year-old isn't. It's rather the average 18-year-old is ignorant and the average 55-year-old is also ignorant, but just not as much. So the whole, some people have said, hey, maybe we should consider lowering the voting age to 16, but only if they, say, pass the U.S. citizenship test. Even if you're already a citizen, you have to pass that to earn the right to vote. And what's funny about that standard is, if you think that's right, most American adults cannot pass that test. Like, it's been run. This isn't like a hypothetical thing. Experiments have been run, and the overwhelming majority of people could not pass it.
And I completely agree with that. And I think a lot of individuals in society typically just aren't necessarily equipped to be technocratic. They don't. They're not experts on health policy. They're not experts on foreign policy. Yet we see that they tend to vote ideologically and not maybe pragmatically. And going back to, the problem with democracy. So in a system of epistocracy, what would a realistic image of that look like practically? How would it work?
Yeah, so there are well-known problems with democracy in that it incentivizes people to be ignorant and misinformed and to participate in politics in sort of irrational ways. Irrational if their purpose is to make a better world, not necessarily irrational if they have another purpose, which in fact they do. And the reason for that has to do with because your vote doesn't matter very much. You can afford to indulge various biases. You can afford to remain ignorant and so on. It's not that people are stupid. It's that democracy makes them dumb. If you change the incentives, you get better behavior. Unfortunately, there's not really a good way to change the incentives because in order to make people better informed, you have to make their vote count for more. But if you make their vote count more, then you give them a strong incentive to act selfishly and to use power for their own ends against everybody else. So we're kind of stuck between two choices. One is a small number of smart voters who vote selfishly against the public interest and for their own interest, or a large number of dumb voters who vote altruistically but in largely symbolic ways that in fact backfire and hurt everybody. Neither one's really that great. So the idea behind an epistocracy is what if you in one way or another weigh votes according to knowledge? And the crudest form of it, which is the form that everybody argues against because it's the easiest one to argue against, is you only get the right to vote if you demonstrate some degree of competence. Like you have to get like a voter license. That's not the form that I advocate, but when people criticize me, that's the one they seize on because they want to make it easy for themselves to argue against me. The actual form that I think is worth trying, which I think might even be legal, and actually arguably might even be a form of democracy, there's a real philosophical question here, is what I call enlightened preference voting, or sometimes I've called it government by simulated oracle. And the idea behind this is on election day or during a referendum, everybody gets to vote, including children and everybody else. There's no reason to exclude anyone. When you vote, you all participate equally. You don't have any weighing ahead of time. But what happens when you vote is you do three things. The first thing you do is you tell us what it is you want. So if we're voting on a presidential candidate, you say who you prefer. If it's a referendum, you tell us your position, etc. The second thing you do is you tell us who you are. You put down your demographic information, things like race and gender identity, sex, income level, where you live, religious affiliation, and so on, because these things affect how people vote, and they're going to be necessary when we do the final step. The third thing we do is we find out what you know. So we give you a big question, like 20-question quiz or 30-question quiz of very basic political information. Can you identify the president, the vice president, your congressperson, which parties control Congress? Can you identify the unemployment rate and a few other factors within, say, a couple percentage points? We can talk later about what determines who determines what gets on the test, but some basic test of political information and low-level information, not even high-level information. When you get these three sets of data, who people are, what they know, and what they want, you're then able to statistically estimate what would the public have wanted if it were demographically identical to the actual public, but had gotten a perfect score on the test. So it's a way of, in a sense, extracting information from the voters because you're able to control for things like the effect of race or income and able to say, here's what a more knowledgeable public that is otherwise identical to the actual population of the U.S. would have voted for. And you could just do that instead. Or alternatively, even if you don't make it a law that you have to do what the enlightened public wants, you could do this as a kind of advisory thing. So a nice example of this would be we have enough data on voters during Brexit that you can actually run this simulation and you can say, had I waved a magic wand and made the British population exactly identical to who it is right during the Brexit vote, but made them perfectly informed, they would have voted to remain rather than leave. Right? That's clear. And then if people ask, well, what about Hillary versus Trump? Like, had we run an enlightened preference model during that election, what would have happened? And the actual answer is, it's the wrong question because if we were using enlightened preference voting, the parties would have run different candidates. The quality of the candidate and the type of person that they push as a candidate depends upon what the electorate is like and what voting system you have. So had we had this kind of more enlightened version of voting, they would have run better, higher quality candidates.
Because the voters would have been higher quality.
Yeah, because the decision process is one that selects for, that relies upon information, that is not bamboozled by false news and so on. So think of it this way, like the parties just want to win power. That's what they really care about fundamentally. In the same way that like a business person just wants to win customers and they're happy to sell tomatoes or tangerines, whatever gets them the money. Political parties at the end of the day, they may have some background ideology, though they're not that strongly attached to it, empirically it turns out, but they want to win. And so they push candidates that they think are likely to appeal to the median voter. If the median voter is, kind of a misinformed ideological dingbat, then you're going to get a candidate who appeals to that person. If the median voter is a well-informed, kind of dispassionate social scientific thinker, you'll get someone who appeals to that. This system doesn't really transform the median voter into someone smart, but it kind of, what it does is it makes you take the raw clay of what we have in democracy, these uninformed voters, and you nevertheless get them to make a decision based upon information that, even though they lack it. And so you have you'd have candidates, you'd have parties worried about, well, what would we have to do to win under this new voting system? And that means that we can't rely upon as many falsehoods. We can't bamboozle people. We can't, we have to do what appeals to people who know things.
And whenever you make that case, a lot of your opponents basically use that idea of the educated voters should basically be weighed over non-educated voters. I mean, what's your top comeback to that when people say, well, it's not fair to these people who are uneducated. They should
Yeah.
still have a right to vote because they're citizens.
Yeah, so two things. One is that objection partly is based on a misunderstanding of the thesis. So I'm not saying what we should do is on election day you take a test, and if you're educated you get to vote, and if you're uneducated you don't get to vote. I'm not even saying you take a test and the more you know, the more votes you get. I'm rather saying everyone gets to vote, you all participate equally, but we statistically estimate what the public would have wanted if it had gotten a perfect score on a basic information test. So at the end, no one really gets more votes than anybody else, and no one is excluded. And that's one reason why some people who've read my book say, well, the actual system you favor, you call it epistocracy, but it's really just a fancy form of democracy. And if that's true, I'm okay with that. I mean, it's sell fewer copies of the book, I guess, but whatever. I'm not super stuck on the labels. On the other hand, when people talk about fairness, I'm not sure they're actually into fairness. I don't think people actually advocate democracy on the basis of fairness. And the reason is because democracy is not particularly fair. So one reason it's not fair is that there's something called persistent ideological minorities. So people like me, I favor open borders. No one favors open borders. I never get my way. I favor complete drug decriminalization. Most people don't. I'll never get my way. Or you could think about persistent, say, racial minorities. So imagine you have a society that is 99% white and 1% Native American, and all the white people are racist against Native Americans and always want to choose policies that hurt them. And now imagine we give everyone equal voting rights, and people are allowed to do whatever they want. Well, that'd be a system in which, even though Native Americans, each individual Native American has as much voting power as any white person, by hypothesis, you'd expect that wouldn't make any difference, and in fact, white people would vote against Native American interests. So if you actually cared about fairness, you wouldn't really use a voting system, which just lets the majority or the plurality get its way. You'd use some kind of lottery system. So you might do something like, all right, we're going to determine who the president is. We have 210 million eligible people. We will select one by lottery. Aha, congratulations, you're now the president. That would be fair. Everyone literally gets an equal chance, regardless of background characteristics, to become president. You don't have to be a Kennedy. You don't have to be a Clinton or a Bush. You don't have to have gone to Harvard or some other fancy place. You win, right? That would be fair. No one advocates that because they think there's too much of a chance of a disaster. So here's another system that would be even more fair than democracy. We have a vote, say there are regular political parties, and we have votes and so on. But then at the end, rather than it being like, well, the Republicans got 46% of the vote, the Democrats got 43%, the Libertarians got 2% or whatever, so therefore the Republicans win, you would instead say, well, each party gets a percent chance of winning based upon what percent of votes it gets. And then once again, you run a random number generator. Oh, the random number generator picked the number 3. That corresponds to the Greens. So even though the Greens only got 1% of the vote, they still had an actual chance of winning. That would be more fair. But we don't do that because people think it has too much of a chance of getting fringe or crazy people up into office. So I think fairness matters, but it doesn't matter that much. And you can see that because if people actually cared about fairness, they wouldn't be Democrats. They'd favor a lottery system, like the Greeks had. The Greeks had a lottery. That's how they ran their democracy.
Is that how you found this idea of government? Was it from the Greeks, Plato specifically, where the rule by the wise?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is based upon stuff that Plato advocated, though whether he really believed it or not is not really clear. The book The Republic, where he talks about this, is not a book of political philosophy. It's a book about trying to prove that you should be a good person even if it had no external reward. I mean, the central question of The Republic is not what is a just society, is rather, why should I be good? What's in it for me? Right? That's what the book is trying to answer. And the model of a perfect society that Socrates gives is not actually meant to be a theory of politics, but rather supposed to describe a perfectly ordered society, which is then a metaphor for a perfectly ordered soul. And the argument is that a virtuous person, even if his life is horrible on the outside, has a well-ordered soul, so therefore he's happy. And then Socrates is like, yeah, I'm not even really sure if that works. But, I mean, that's what the Republic is. So more recently, though, there's a book by David Estlund, a philosopher at Brown and a former colleague of mine, and he wrote a book called Democratic Authority, and he was very critical of the idea that democracy is justified as an end in itself, or that it's justified because it's fair. So he wanted to try to argue that what justifies democracy at the end of the day is if not entirely, at least to a significant degree, how well it performs compared to the alternatives. But he had a problem, though, because at least in principle, in theory, some form of epistocracy, and he's the one that coined that term, could outperform democracy by weighing votes or by excluding certain voters. And he had to try to find some way to attack epistocracy while also defending democracy from people who think all that matters is fairness and so on. So this debate, yes, there is a long genesis of it. It ultimately comes from 2,500 years ago. You see elements of it in the late 1700s when various French and English and American philosophers are writing about why have a democracy over other systems. But in a sense, it's been reinvigorated in the past 10 or 11 years because of work by David Eflin.
That's very interesting. I mean, I haven't even remembered the last time I read Republic by Plato. I think it was probably 5-6 years ago, but that totally makes sense to me. I was actually going to kind of go back to the functionality of the idea. Now, you mentioned that this system would essentially, be implemented, but who decides the tests? Is it a board of nonpartisan officials? Is it a computer program? What basically makes this function?
Yeah, so the question, I think, is in terms of assessing what the enlightened public would have wanted, you could come up with a formal rule ahead of time about you're going to weigh each question the same. And then once you do that, you can basically take all the votes, anonymize them, and make it public. And any newspaper, any political scientist really could analyze the data and estimate what an enlightened public would have wanted. So that part's not too hard. It can be easily sort of fact-checked. The real issue, I think, which is what you're getting at, is who decides which questions go on the test? So an idea that I have, which may sound paradoxical, but I don't think it is that we have democratic deliberation decide which questions are going to go on the test for we're trying to figure out what do we think an enlightened public would know? What do we think a fully informed and public would know? We let democracy decide that. So you say randomly, 6 months before the election, you randomly select 500 citizens, sort of in a jury duty style kind of issue. You select them, by law, they're allowed to take a weekend off. You pay them or something to take a weekend off. They get together. They pick the questions that go on the test after deliberating for a few days, and then we use that. That might sound paradoxical because you think, well, if they know which questions should go on the test, then don't they know the answers to those questions, and then wouldn't they vote accordingly? But I think that's actually not true. I think oftentimes people know which questions they should know the answer to without knowing the answer to those questions. So a simple illustration of that is, think of the last time you had a midterm or final exam in a class that you did badly on. You probably knew things like, oh, I'm taking organic chemistry, I'm supposed to know how ketones work, but you don't actually remember. Or, you're taking a class in Latin, you're like, I'm supposed to know the second declension of, how to decline second declension nouns, but I can't remember how to do it. Or I'm supposed to remember the proof of the fundamental theorem of calculus, but I can't actually do it. I think when you go and poll people and you ask them, what does it take to be a good voter? What should voters know? They give very much the same answers that I give. But then if you ask people those questions, the things that they think, well, what do you think a good voter should know? They're like, well, they should know who the president is. They should know the unemployment rate. Maybe they should know the price of a bus ticket across town and the price of a gallon of milk. Great. What's the answer to those questions? Oh, well, we don't know any of the answers. We just think that's what people should know. So I think democracy could decide what goes on the test. You then use the test to calculate what an identical public would have voted for if it had been fully informed, and voila, you get at least, if not perfect government, you certainly wouldn't get that, you get what will probably be better performing government, more just, less war, less suffering, more prosperity.
And I do find it to be a very meritocratic system. And I think I had read an article a while back on how the West has basically become more authoritarian, kind of more right-wing, so to speak. And one of the key things in there was a rejection of meritocracy. And do you think that based on a rejection of meritocracy that would hurt this kind of system to be implemented? If it were implemented, long-term solution, would people just reject the idea? Maybe they don't want a good society. Maybe they just want a society that favors them. Would it be stable?
Yeah, it's a good question whether it would be stable. And to be honest, I don't know if we really know. And I think I say in the book that I think I face the same problem that, say, someone like Jefferson or other people in the late 1700s faced when they were arguing for Republican forms of government. We know there's certain theoretical problems with monarchy, and there are certain real-life problems with monarchy. We have certain theoretical reasons to think that republicanism would improve upon it, but we don't really know till we try it. And it turned out they were right about some things and wrong about others. It turned out that certain things they thought would fix certain problems actually didn't fix them or led to worse problems. And that's true of what I'm advocating, too. We don't really know how it works till we try it. That said, I think there's some reason to think that it would be stable, and ultimately it comes down to the way people think about politics. People think whatever political system they grew up with is legitimate. That tends to be how they think. Right? I mean, it is true that you sometimes get waves of disillusionment and calls for other systems, but in general, the system that people grew up with, they think is natural and normal and sort of doesn't need to be justified, and it's only alternative systems that have to be sort of questioned. So transitioning from a fully democratic system, well, not that we even have that, but transitioning from a democratic system to a kind of epistocratic system would be difficult, but once it's been done, I think people would accept it. And if anything, I think that's a problem with people. You go to China and people think the Chinese government is legitimate. You go to Iran and people think the Iranian government is legitimate. You go to the U.S., people think the American government is legitimate. I don't think any of those governments are legitimate, but people just accept what they're accustomed to. So to some degree, because people are kind of conformist cowards who go with the flow, once the system is in place, I think they'll go along with it. Not to the credit of the system, though, but because of problems of human nature, that's why they'll fall in line.
One of the phenomenon where I've seen that happen is when Germany reunited, with a lot of East Germans, a lot of East Germans grew up with the communist system, and a lot of East Germans still miss that communist system. It was easy. Everything was provided for you, and the government gave you a job, gave you food, gave you housing, and that was easier. They grew up with that system. It was ingrained into them, and then when they reunified, there was certainly a conflict to that. That's kind of what it reminds me of, is everyone around the world is already biased towards their government. I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit to libertarianism, because how I found out about you was through Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and I was wondering, how's that going? Is that still going on? Is Matt Zlowinski still working on that? I believe it was a blog site, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's definitely a blog site. It's not as active now as it was in say 2003 or not 2003, 2011 or so. And I think that's not special to that blog. In general, there's been a kind of dying of blogs over the past 10 years. They were much bigger 10 years ago than they are today, and a lot of philosophy blogs have kind of folded. So people still periodically post to it, but just not as often. As far as the idea, I think in academia, the idea has gained a lot of traction. And the idea is actually really simple. It's if anything, it's saying, if you look at the original classical liberal thinkers like David Hume or Adam Smith or Scottish Enlightenment thinkers or even John Stuart Mill, they were attracted to liberty not simply because they thought that people deserved freedom as a way of showing that you respect them, but because it works. In particular, because it works to the advantage of the worst off, not just the average person or the privileged people, but to the worst off. So if you take Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, why that book was revolutionary was he said, the way you judge the wealth of a country is not by looking at the size of the king's treasury, it's not by looking at the size of the king's army, but by looking at how well the typical person does. And then he was able to show that certain market-oriented systems were greatly outperforming other systems in terms of how much welfare they provided for the typical person. And I think that was the main line of classical liberal thinking up until really after World War II, where for some reason you then got a bunch of people like Murray Rothbard and even Robert Nozick at certain times, so this is really not fair to him, saying, well, liberty though the sky falls, or the fact that liberty works is largely irrelevant to its justification. And so you had this weird thing where what you had were socialist thinkers who were advocating a system that in fact didn't work. It didn't really provide for people, but they were able to say at least it intends to, and that's what justifies it. And then you have libertarians who were often advocating a system that in fact did work, but that thought that the fact that it worked was irrelevant to why we should have it. So I think bleeding heart libertarianism is simply the main line of libertarian thought from which, 1970s and 1980s libertarianism is a kind of aberration.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. One of the biggest things that used to frustrate me with, say, the libertarian movement when I was more involved in it, I'm probably center left now, but one of the biggest frustrations with me was the NAP school of thought, the non-aggression principle, your Rothbard, it's very uncompromising.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I always thought was a bit of a rift between, say, a bleeding heart libertarian and a kind of a more NAP libertarian was the idea of a basic income or a citizen's dividend, or as the Georgists would say, redistribute land rents and stuff like that. How do you convey to libertarians? And I think Mads Lewinsky was more the one that proposed like a basic income type setup or a dividend or a guaranteed minimum income. There's a million different names for it, but I mean, is that compatible with libertarianism?
Yeah, I think it is. Whether it's a good idea or not, on its own merits, I think is a good question. Whether it's affordable is a good question too. But whether it's compatible with it, I think sure, at least in principle. Maybe a difference between, I think, mainline classical liberal thinking was we have certain basic rights, and these are probably due to us in virtue of just being people. But the duties we have to one another greatly underdetermine what kind of political and economic structure we should have. When we talk about the rules of the game of property and the rules of the game of other kinds of institutions, these have to be justified in part by the consequences of playing by certain sorts of rules. And one of the things that justifies these rules is that they pay off to everybody. And that's not just true of people like Adam Smith, an economist, something of a consequentialist, at least in terms of Wealth of Nations. In his other work, he really isn't, but in that book, he does seem to be. It's also true even of like John Locke. When John Locke says it's permissible for you to take stuff out of the commons and turn it into your private property, a key feature of his justification is that in doing so, you will magnify the amount of stuff available to everyone by something like a factor of 10,000, and you basically pay off everybody else by taking things out of the commons. So his argument is, when everything is left in the commons, and in a sense, nobody/everybody owns it, well then everybody's badly off and everybody's poor. When you start dividing and propertizing things, the funny thing is you actually make everybody richer, including the people who come late, who show up in the world when everything's already, in a sense, been privatized. To illustrate that, I certainly was not one of the first people to wander across, the Bering Strait into North America, but I'm much richer than the people who originally came here, even though they supposedly snatched up all the stuff before I got here, right? But I'm vastly richer than they are. When you're asking how much richer, hundreds of times richer than they are. But so I think that's an important way of thinking. That the rules of the game have to be justified in part by the consequences for the people that live by them, and that includes the rules of private property. The other problem with the non-aggression principle is that everyone agrees to it, and that's why it's not a good principle, because it begs the very question in dispute. So if I go up to a Marxist and I'm like, hey man, you're a Marxist. Oh yeah. Do you think people should aggress against one another? Should they initiate unjustified acts of aggression against one another? He's like, no, of course not. And that's precisely the reason I hate capitalism. Because, after all, in a capitalist system, some people illegitimately have stolen property from other people, and they don't share it. And so when the workers take property from the bourgeoisie, they're actually taking their own property back. And when the bourgeoisie hoard the property, they're actually really stealing it from everybody else. So if you want to be a non-aggression principle person, you should really be a Marxist, not a libertarian. The libertarians advocate rampant aggression. And you can see, I know libertarians disagree with that, but you can see where the argument's going. It's the thing in dispute is not whether you can initiate acts of aggression against other people. The thing in dispute is who owns what and why. And the non-aggression principle does not answer that question, right? So everyone, I don't want to say everyone because there are exceptions, but in general, almost everyone of every background ideology accepts the non-aggression principle. The thing that they dispute is who owns what, who deserves what, who's entitled to what. even Rawlsians, when like libertarians say, hey, man, taxes are theft. Well, Rawlsians say no, because the government's entitled to that, and if you keep the property, you're actually stealing from the government. So they don't think they're advocating aggression. They think that they have a substantive dispute about who owns what. So you can't respond to them by touting the non-aggression principle, because it just doesn't answer that question. It's not even meant to. Yeah, so I mean, libertarians, there are times when the non-aggression principle is useful because it's clear that one person really is aggressing against another. But most of the time when they use it to answer these bigger questions, they're inadvertently begging the question against an alternative point of view, and that's why it doesn't convince anyone.
And I mean, do you see that as kind of a problem with maybe libertarians today, that maybe, because I thought that maybe they would become more mainstream, and I think they have to an extent, but I also think that, that ideological wing has kind of hurt them because it's more simplified and it's more fringe. But I mean, I would say, being morally relative, I think helps a lot. And also, I think part of the problem with a lot of libertarians is they have so many different views of different things. So, I mean, for instance, I know a lot of Georgists, for instance, who believe private property should be common, but privately maintained, and, people have private dwellings on it. And that's different than, say, a leftist libertarian who might not believe in private property, or there's just so many different schools of thought. And then, you also have extremists like anarcho-capitalists out there. Now, I don't know if you prescribe to anarcho-capitalism, but by most mainstream standards, it's extreme. I just, is there a way for libertarianism to enter into a mature and kind of mainstream debate, or has kind of the age of Trump basically disproved libertarianism and kind of put it on the back burner?
Yeah, I don't think the issue about there being a lot of ideological disputes within libertarianism is really the problem, because that's true of every other ideology. There's a joke, I don't remember the exact number for the joke to be right from whatever book I got it from, but there's a joke that if you get 13 Marxists into a room, then you'll get 26 views of Marxism. It's true of everything else. It's not like Democrats all agree on everything, and that's settled. The reason I don't even think the lack of appeal of libertarianism to broader people has much to do with the quality of its message, good or bad. Because if you want to know how people think when it comes to politics, you could read my book Against Democracy. Chapter 2 has a lot to say about it. But an even better book to get more about how people think would be Democracy for Realists by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. And what they say is that for the overwhelming majority of people in a modern democracy, they're just not very ideological. They have very few political opinions. The opinions they have are not very stable. So for something like 50% of voters, what it comes down to is you have a certain sense of your identity. Like, I'm African American, I'm a Boston Catholic Irish person, or whatever it might be. And for largely historical circumstances, kind of random circumstances, nothing to do with whether a party promotes your interests or not, certain identities get attached to certain parties. And then people just vote for those parties because that's what people like them do. So in the same way that I root for the Red Sox and the Patriots because I'm from Boston, people with my demographics also just tend to be Democrat, and it has nothing to do with the Democrats being good for people with my demographics. It's just historical accident, and you can prove that. And then they say, for another 40% of people, if you ask them, they do appear to have more stable political opinions, but their opinions are not real opinions. It's more like, you can see this with, say, the Republicans. 10 years ago, every Republican's a free trader. Trump comes along, he wins the nomination, he's anti-free trade, pro-protectionism, and suddenly Republicans switch from being pro-free trade to anti-free trade, and Democrats do a reversal and go the other way. And if you ask those people, why did you change their mind, they say, I never changed my mind, I've always thought this. So it's really going on when most people say things like, we should raise the minimum wage to $15, or we should let more immigrants stay in the country, or we should, whatever the policy may, we should, be more pro-life and overturn Roe versus Wade. They don't really mean what they say. What they actually mean is, yay Republican, yay Democrats. It's a way of sort of expressing your fidelity to your team, And the purpose of ideology is not to describe the way you think the world should be, but to sort of show you're a member of your tribe. Maybe only like 1 out of 10 people is like genuinely ideological and actually votes for parties on the basis of their political beliefs. So I think, I think in a sense, libertarianism cannot easily break into the mainstream, but that has nothing to do with the quality of the arguments in libertarianism. It just has to do with like how people get assigned to things. If tomorrow the Democrats just randomly decided to advocate like libertarian ideas, then all of a sudden libertarianism would be mainstream. If they randomly decide to advocate Marxist ideas, then Marxism would be mainstream. It has nothing to do with the quality of the argument or the quality of the evidence. We're giving citizens too much credit when we think that matters.
And another libertarian position that I've seen being debated was immigration. You're obviously an open borders advocate. And I mean, a lot of Americans, even I think many on the left, like Bernie Sanders, would be opposed to open borders. Can you basically, and I think you're the best person to give like a simple response, why should the average American support open borders?
Yeah, I mean, as my friend Brian Kaplan puts it, open borders is the utilitarian, egalitarian, sufficientarian, libertarian, efficient way of doubling world product. Like, that's the reason. So, economists like to calculate how much damage do tariffs and things like that do to the world economy? How much richer would we be if there were no tariffs anywhere in the world? A good estimate is that if I waved my magic wand and I eliminated all trade restrictions, including regulations that also end up becoming trade restrictions, I might increase the total amount of wealth produced in the world per year, total amount of income, total amount of production by maybe like 5%, which is a lot. And that would help a lot of people. Yeah. If I were to completely eliminate all migration restrictions and allow anyone to take a job anywhere that they could get one, regardless, the same way that I can move from Massachusetts to Virginia, you could move from Virginia to anywhere in the world and vice versa, and take any job offered to you and live anywhere anyone wants to either sell you a house or rent you the house. The average estimate in the literature is that would double world product. Now, sometimes that literature is a bit optimistic in the sense that it presumes that people will move if they can make more money by moving. Empirically speaking, that's probably not literally true. It's more like people will move to a culture where they feel foreign if they will double their income, but maybe not for less than that. But even if you put in this more realistic assumption into your model, what you get is something like every year we're destroying, we have $60 trillion of production left on the table that does not appear because we have restricted borders. And whom does that benefit? Well, it turns out it benefits almost everyone. It disproportionately benefits the world's extreme poor. They would benefit tremendously from open borders. But it also benefits almost all domestic workers and domestic income earners in the already rich countries. The only group that you can provide some real evidence that they might be hurt by open borders in, like compared to the status quo, would be like very low educated, unskilled workers living in so-called first world countries. In the short term, they might see their incomes go down by a little bit, though in the long term, they'd see their incomes go up too. So it's kind of like, a good way of thinking about it. I mean, I have a lot to say about open borders, wrote a whole book on it, but and like all the various objections to it. But a good starting point is to say we could have an extra $60 trillion a year, which would increase year after year thanks to compounding, if only we had open borders. So whatever your complaints are about open borders, they have to add up to $60 trillion worth of bads, or we should do it.
That's probably the best way to do it. I think everyone responds to money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but then you might have people who might not respond to that. Well, they might think more about their tribe than the world.
Yeah, we call that. I think those are bad people, but yeah. I mean, if you're saying someone like, look, I love America, I'm an American, I love Americans so much that I'm willing to really, really hurt other people in the rest of the world, and also, by the way, hurt my fellow Americans who want to trade with them and hire them because I love Americans so much. I'm like, you're kind of a bad community member.
Yeah.
You're like imagine I was in a fraternity. Imagine fraternity members are like, I love my fraternity so much that when you want to be friends with someone else outside the fraternity, I'm not going to let you. I'm going to punch you in the face if you try. I'm kind of like, dude, what the hell?
Yeah.
Right. So those sorts of no, nationalism, therefore close borders. I'm like, no, you're not a good member of the community.
Do you think international governing agencies are a catalyst for open borders? For instance, like the United Nations, or do you think that, because a lot of people absolutely despise the UN. I'm not one of them. I think it's a valuable organization, has its flaws, but it's, you know. Do you think that having international organizations increases the probability of open borders, or
To be
does
honest,
it intensify it?
I honestly have no idea what effect the UN has on any of this stuff, to be honest. I mean, I have read some stuff on it, but I think it's just super ambiguous, and I don't really know.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, yeah,
just
it's a good
figured,
question. I just don't know.
like
Yeah.
trade agreements and like if the world had absolutely free trade, no tariffs, it might be
Yeah,
different.
I mean, even then, I'm not. The UN often pushes for that stuff, but I'm not sure how successful it is. And then often it pushes for like things that end up working the other way, where it will sneak in certain kinds of hidden restrictions on trade and so on. So, I think the World Bank overall tends to push for liberalization, but I don't really know what the UN does here.
Oh, okay. I was just
Which isn't to say, I don't even want to say like for sure that like it's ambiguous in the sense that like no one knows. I'm just more like, given what I've read, I don't know. There might be some answer, but I just don't know what it is.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, getting away from libertarianism a little bit and open borders. One of the last things I kind of wanted to ask you about was kind of your new book, Ivory Towers. I have not gotten to it yet, but you have some. I've heard from many people about it that have read it, and it's a very interesting take on academia. I believe somebody talked to me about how certain universities, how they advertise to students, is kind of debunked in a way. Or, I mean, could you elaborate on Ivory Towers a little bit?
Yeah, so Cracks in Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Ed. It's a book that Phil Magnus and I just published with Oxford University Press back in May. And what it is, it's a systematic look at the internal political economy of higher education and then a critique of our moral behavior, but it's explained by incentives. So we say is lots of things are going bad in higher ed, including stuff that's invisible to most people. Like the things that you get on the news are actually not that big a deal compared to the stuff that we talk about. But it's not explained by bad apples ruining the bunch. It's not explained by nefarious forces like the social justice movement or neoliberalism or corporatism. These things are pretty ephemeral and don't really have much of an effect. What it's explained by is that when you have these massive bureaucracies, you often have internal rules that incentivize people to act badly. And often you have situations where people can promote their self-interest at the expense of everybody else and pass off the costs on to others. So a good example of this would be, we look at, for example, gen eds. Most universities in the United States and Canada require you to take a bunch of courses in a bunch of different fields. They don't just let you take your major courses. The nominal reason that's offered for that is pretty sensible. They say, well, if you're a college graduate, you should know some history. You should know something about race and gender and diversity. You should know something about mathematics. You should know some science. You should know how to write, etc. Those all seem completely sensible to me. But then we ask, okay, well, how well did gen eds work? We look at the empirical literature and we find out, it turns out they don't work. Comp classes don't teach you to write. Math classes don't teach you to do math. At the end, these gen ed classes don't deliver the goods they're supposed to. So that's pretty suspicious, but let's keep going. We then ask, what predicts whether you'll be required to take a gen ed class in a particular department? You might notice at a typical university, they'll have a rule that says you have to take, say, one science class, but you can pick any class you want. But on the other hand, you must take 3 classes in composition with the English department. So what predicts whether you'll have to take a class with this department or not? The biggest and most powerful predictor that you'll be required to take a class in a department is how financially needy that department is. Certain departments, like economics, have lots of money, great job markets, lots of external funding. They have a very high student-to-faculty ratio. They hardly ever show up as required classes. Other departments, like English, have plummeting enrollments. Hardly anyone is getting an English degree anymore. They have a very high faculty-to-student ratio. They get very little outside money, and their market stinks. Those departments, in turn, then lobby the internal governance of the university and say, on behalf of the students, we need to force them to take our classes. And then because they're the ones lobbying for it, they succeed and they get their way, and ever more classes are required. And these classes don't actually work. So we think this is not just a bad thing, but I mean, we think it's just not only is it ineffective, we think it's actually downright evil. Because we think, look, people, imagine like the typical poor student who can just barely go to college, and you're forcing that student to take out, say, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in debt and spend hundreds or thousands of hours of time working on classes that don't actually help her because it benefits you. Because in most schools, for every student you have in the seat, you get more money for your department and for yourself. It's evil, but that's the thing that predicts gen eds. If a department needs money, you have to take classes in it. If departments don't need money, you don't. It does matter if the department's big enough to lobby effectively, but still, it's financial exigency.
It sounds
That's pretty
selfish.
bad. Oh, it's straight up selfishness, and it's also obvious. If you've ever been on a faculty meeting, it's obvious this happens because you actually hear people say this. But we can't just rely on anecdotes. We have to like do a data-driven thing, and the data reinforces the anecdotes. When it comes to advertising, we say something like, "Dude, imagine BMW said we have a brand new car and." It goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. And you're like, well, did you test to see whether it goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds? No, but we firmly believe it. And suppose they're sincere, right? They wouldn't be allowed to advertise it. And if they did, and you then drove it and it didn't go that fast, you'd be able to sue them and you'd win. It'd be fraudulent, right? It's false advertising. Or, well, it's not false. It's what we call negligent advertising. Imagine a drug company said, we have a new drug. It's called Calligra. If you take this drug 256 times over the next, per year, over a 4-year period and pay about $100,000 to take it, it will make you smarter, more globally minded, more intelligent, better able to do mathematics, et cetera, et cetera. And you say to Pfizer, okay, did you test to see whether Calligra works? And they go, no, we didn't test it, but we very sincerely believe that it works. Well, they wouldn't be allowed to advertise that. The FDA would forbid it. And if they did somehow sell the drug, you'd be able to sue them and get your money back. What's going on here is that Calligra, that drug, is effectively what's happening in college advertising. We go through and we collect the kinds of promises that universities make. We find that they have not tested to see whether they actually deliver these promises, so they already look pretty bad. But worse, there's independent evidence from a variety of educational psychologists which shows that, as a matter of fact, universities don't deliver their promises. So, in a sense, universities are engaging in kinds of advertising that no drug company or no automobile company would dare make, and which they would not legally be allowed to.
Is that kind
they
of
make
like when
big promises and they don't keep them?
Is that like when you see a commercial for a university and they say, "Oh, we have this great program. You're going to get a job right away, and you're going to be number one, and we have like the best school for business and all that stuff."
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be true, correct?
Right. I mean, unless they make there's certain kinds of claims they can make that they could get in trouble for. Like if they say we have 7,000 students and they actually have 50,000, they could probably get in trouble for that. But when they say things like we will provide a transformative education that will prepare you for any job and will make you blah blah blah, like these highfalutin values, they get away with advertising that in a way that a drug company would not be able to. The other thing that happens too is even if you get a job, it's oftentimes the mechanism that explains why you get the job that they advertise isn't true. So it's true that like people who go to Harvard tend to be much more successful than people that go to, say, University of Massachusetts, Boston. Now, are they successful because they went to Harvard, or are they successful because they were good enough to get into Harvard? So we go through the evidence and say, oh, it actually looks like the evidence overwhelmingly shows it wasn't going to Harvard that mattered. It was being good enough to get in the first place. It didn't matter that they graduated from a university rather than not, but it didn't matter they actually went to Harvard. If you're admitted to Harvard and you don't go, but you go to like, the next tier down, like George Washington or something, you'll do just as well as the person who actually went to Harvard in the long run on almost everything. There are a couple exceptions, but on almost any major thing you will. So even when they say, like, our graduates get jobs, it might not be because the university is helping that much. It might simply be because the selection process to get in selects for the kind of people that are going to get the jobs anyways.
Oh, okay. I mean,
so there's a lot of we call it negligent advertising. It's just they make promises, they sincerely believe what they say, but they haven't done the testing and they don't have the data to prove they deliver on the promises that they make, and worse, independently, we have very strong evidence that they, in fact, don't deliver.
That's really sad.
It's incredibly depressing.
And then you combine the fact that we have a student loan debt crisis in the country, And these professors are probably a major cause of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a kind of unfortunate thing here that happens too, where some of the student loan problems are coming about precisely because we subsidize universities.
Yep.
So, if I imagine the government says, we're really sad that too many young people at age 20 can't afford Honda Civics. So what we'll do is, if you want to buy a Honda Civic, we'll give you $10,000 towards the price of the Honda. What you'd expect Honda to do would be, instead of charging, I don't actually know what charging for a Honda Civic, instead of charging $18,000 for a Honda Civic, we'll charge $28,000 because suddenly everyone has more money.
Yep.
So that's generally what happens when you subsidize things in the for-profit sector. If you provide a subsidy to buy X and it's a big subsidy and lots of people get it, then X just goes up in price and you don't actually help the people you're trying to help. But that's the for-profit sector. It could turn out that universities, being lovingly committed to social justice and equality and merit, would not respond the same way. Unfortunately, it turns out they do. So work has been done on this, and what you find is that every time the government gives people subsidies, when it's giving lots and lots of people subsidies to go to higher ed responds by raising tuition prices and capturing that money. So that's not to say there should be no government subsidizing of education, but if you're going to do it, you have to do it differently. So one thing you might do is only give it to a small number of genuinely poor people rather than giving it to large numbers of people. Another thing you might do is you make these subsidies available, but you have to implement price controls of some sort, which has its own can of worms that it opens. But you have to say, like, okay, we're going to give everybody, $20,000 to go to college, but we're also going to forbid universities from charging more than, say, $20,000, because otherwise they just eat the money.
See, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, you'd hope that universities, being nonprofit, wouldn't act this way, but they do. So we have to change our policies.
And it's even more sad that public universities act that way because, they're tax funded.
Yeah, well, public universities often have they have they have their own perverse set of incentives because
really,
they often lose a lot of money on in-state students. So they, as much as possible, they want to admit out-of-state students so they can charge more tuition dollars. And even better, people from foreign countries that don't qualify for any financial aid at all and get subsidized entirely by their governments. That's why students love, Chinese students. You can charge them like $60,000 a year. You might be, I don't know the actual numbers for UNC. I'm making these up, but maybe you're UNC Chapel Hill, and if you get a North Carolina student, you can charge them, say, $15,000 in tuition, and you lose money on them. But you get a Chinese student, you can charge them, say, $45,000, and you make money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they do that, and everyone knows that they do this too. It's not even like a secret that this is what happens. And that's not to say that these students aren't qualified to come in, but you do have these perverse incentives. And so one thing that some legislatures will do is try to have rules about how many foreign and how many out-of-state students you have. But they're always looking for alternative forms of money. So then they might do things like, well, we have our official undergraduate program, but then we have a special continuing studies degree that is sort of like a off-the-books undergrad program, and then we can charge more money for that and make money that way.
Why do you think no one has really brought this issue to attention? Is it because people just assume that universities have good intentions, or do we have we have our head in the sand, so to speak? Are we ostriches, or do we just assume they're good and we don't think about it?
Yeah, I think part of it is that there's this idea that universities have a noble mission, so therefore the people working there must have noble intentions.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of books complaining about what universities do, but they tend to be very ideological. They don't really look at what's really going on. So what you do is you get like people from the right, and they say, the problem with universities is that they're full of Marxist and social justice warriors, and let's complain about all the bad stuff they do. And you know what? They're right about some of that stuff. Like I'm reading even a book right now written by like a hardcore feminist, but it's complaining about like stuff that other feminist scholars have done to ruin things in academia in various ways. She's right about some of that stuff. Social justice activism can go too far and can mess things up. Mm-hmm. But it's not the real problem. And then on the left, you get people saying, oh, well, neoliberalism has taken over and we have to fight that. And it's not really clear what that means. And Phil and I in the book actually operationalize that and test it and find that it can't possibly be true. But still, notice what everyone's doing. They're basically going to say whatever is wrong with the university is to be blamed by badly motivated people on the other side acting badly. And if we could just, get rid of all those bad people and those, we call them gremlins and poltergeists. If we could get rid of the gremlins and poltergeists that are sabotaging the university, everything would be fine. And Phil and I instead say, before you go looking at ghost stories, just look at the incentives. How do people get paid? How do they get status and power for themselves? And how often are they in a situation where they can do things that benefit themselves at the expense of others and get away with it? Once you start looking for that, using these basic economic tools, you can analyze like a lot of the very fundamental things we do in universities, like the way we allocate grades and the way we decide who has to take which classes, start looking pretty bad. So we think like the problems are more fundamental and they're not caused, and this sort of like conspiracy theorizing that most people want to engage in actually deludes them and prevents them from seeing what's really going on, which is actually worse than the stuff that they're theorizing about.
Yeah, I mean that's all an excellent point. I feel like I've already known all of this, but until you point it out, you don't really think about it. It's kind of hidden in plain view.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we say in that book, we think if you're a reader, you should go, yeah, I knew that.
Yeah.
But the difference is just we could be like, yeah, you knew it, but we have real evidence for it. It turns out your suspicions are correct and we can verify them. But yeah, when people take gen ed classes, they're often like, this is bullshit. This is really just about helping the English department, not about helping me. Because, I mean, it didn't help, right? It didn't work. It didn't make me a better writer, but it did get them more money. So They knew that, but we can prove it. That's the difference.
And that's like that idea of the, they always tell kids, you should go to a 2-year school and get your gen eds knocked out. Well, why should I have to go to another school to take classes that don't affect what I'm doing? I don't know. It seems kind of like a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe you'd think maybe they would respond to the fact that people have to go to a different school to get it done and then transfer those credits over. But I don't know. Maybe people are just selfish. It doesn't help. It just doesn't. I mean, I'm a millennial, like a lot of other millennials out there. The student loan debt crisis touches a lot of people, and I think sometimes we always point our fingers at, college isn't free, and but honestly, like you said with the Honda Civics, I mean, if I gave 16-year-old girls each $100 or maybe $1,000 and I put them in a mall, I mean, the mall's going to raise their prices.
Yep.
So a lot of that's common sense. But
if you want free education, by the way, because people point to Europe and say in many parts of Europe education is free. Yes, fair enough. But then ask yourself, and I'm not giving you the answer. I'm just saying ask yourself this: do you want European education? Because if you go to look at a lot of German universities, they don't have the fancy gymnasiums and the rock climbing walls, and it's often very large classes with distant professors and not these like small classes with like 12 students and one professor. You get like you don't live in like a fancy dormitory. You live with your parents, or you live off site or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing necessarily wrong with European universities. I mean, I wouldn't work there because they don't pay enough when it comes to faculty, but There's nothing wrong with them from a student experience, but it's a very different kind of product from the student user standpoint than what you're getting at a typical 4-year American college or university. So sure, we could have European-style free college, but it would look different from what you have. What I think most people picture is, I want this sort of lush, extended 4-year summer camp that is Hamilton College, but I want the government to pay for it. It's not going to happen. Like, what you might get is like what it's like to go to the University of Heidelberg.
It's like driving a car without, GPS and all the bells and whistles. It's just you're gonna drive. It's a motor, it's a steering wheel, it's a pedal. That's all you get, but it's free.
Yeah, but it's free. And hey, maybe that's what we should do. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm just saying that's the realistic alternative. It's not what people currently picture, which is maintain the status quo with all the bells and whistles, but just have it subsidized by taxpayers. I would say I'm not in favor of like universal free higher ed, because I think too many people go to college already. I think we're past the point of optimal social investment. But also, I think from a left-wing point of view, this has got to be a really, really low status issue. The way we're thinking about it is like, you give me, I don't know, how much do you think it costs for everyone to go? Like $100 billion a year, and I can distribute that any way I see fit with the goal of promoting social justice causes. I'm sure as hell not going to give it to a bunch of upper middle class privileged kids so they can get a higher degree. I can think of lots of other things I can do with that money before I give it to them. I'm going to give it to like genuinely poor people in all other parts of the world. And then if I'm not allowed to do that, I'm going to give it to genuinely poor people in the U.S. I'm not going to give it to the kinds of people who go to college. Those people are generally super privileged. Not all of them, but in general they are.
That was a criticism in the last Democratic debate. It was a lot of people argued for that, and a couple of candidates were like, "Hey, that's just going to benefit upper middle class kids."
Yeah,
and it's
now,
not
I understand that there are
people.
Yeah, that's right. There are. I mean, I do understand there are people who are not upper middle class who go to college and they could benefit from subsidies, but that's how that should work in the first place. It shouldn't be as much government subsidies for like the higher level people. It should be for the genuinely poor. We have food stamps for people who can't afford food. I don't get food stamps because I can afford it. We don't have subsidizing my food consumption. So targeted subsidies to a small number of genuinely poor people, there's a lot to be said for that. The kind of mass subsidization that you get for everybody, what that ends up being is a transfer to upper class people, and at the same time it actually increases the price, making it ever more unsustainable.
Just another middle class entitlement.
Yeah. I mean, there are other reasons why college is too expensive. There's a thing, I'm not going to get into it, but you can Google the following words: Baumol's cost disease, BAUMOL apostrophe S, cost disease. Google that in college, and you'll find out like another reason why colleges are too expensive, and a thing that's not easy to fix. But subsidies do in fact backfire.
Now that we've got through ivory towers, or cracking the ivory tower, I want to ask you one last question because we're kind of approaching on an hour here. And it's more of a levity question because normally we get serious, and I have one more less serious question. And that would be because I saw you go on a vacation with your wife, and in every single picture, you had the old rock symbol up with, your hand there. The horns, right? Okay.
Yeah, the horns.
I have to ask you, what is like a metal band right now that you would recommend?
I think there are going to be a lot of people that will be mad by this, but I think there's a lot to be said for listening to Ghost. Ghost's new album, Prequel, it's very accessible to people who aren't metalheads, which is one reason some metalheads hate it, but it's something new. It's kind of a synthesis of almost a Swedish kind of happy pop dance beat with like some dark satanic lyrics and lyrics about death. It's sing-songy, it's orchestral, it's original, innovative, and it sounds great. That was really Ghost's Prequel was my album of the year in 2018. So I'd recommend that. I do listen to some more extreme metal, and I listen to some like less extreme metal, but that's the thing that I think is most interesting happening in metal right now.
Yeah. Have you heard of Alien Weaponry by chance?
Alien Weaponry?
Yeah.
I have not, but I will look. What are they like?
They're a thrash. They're from New Zealand. They're all 18 years old, and they sing in Maori.
All right. Oh, I have heard of them then. Yes, I remember hearing about them.
Oh, okay. They're I can't believe that, and especially for a three-piece group to sound that good.
Yeah.
It's just you don't see a lot of three-piece metal groups out there.
No, usually need. Yeah. Well, I will listen to more of them when we get off the phone.
Yeah. Well, anyways, it was really good to have you on. I'm sorry Brett couldn't make it. Normally we do it as a pair. But I really hope you have a good weekend, and I hope you enjoy your time with your family.
Thanks. Yeah, have a good weekend too, man.
Oh yeah, you too, and thank you for coming on my show. So.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, have a good one, Jason.
Cheers.
All right, bye. And that concludes Season 1, Episode 6. I would like to tell our viewers out there that we are now on CastBox and Stitcher, so make sure you subscribe. Probably going to be a while before we come out with some content. This might be the last episode of Season 1. I don't know yet. Make sure you subscribe to us. Make sure you follow us. Make sure you check out our RSS feed, and I'd like to bid you all adieu.